We're talking gardening now because lots of us, of course, enjoy watching Gardener's World on the BBC, but most of us don't have the great big gardens, don't look as perfect as sometimes they can seem on that show, and that includes one of the presenters.
Yes, Frances Tophill moved into a house with a fairly small outside space, but she's turned it into a piece of horticultural... Oh, I can't even say this. Horticultural...
Portugal?
I wish it was. Portugal? No, horticultural heaven. Before we speak to her, let's see Frances in action on Gardener's World.
This is incredible. Look at all these primulas. Have you planted these?
So we didn't actually plant any of these. They came here as seedlings, probably on the wind. It's a particularly damp area of the garden, and each year they just spread and spread and spread.
They've done the design work for you as well, haven't they? Those beautiful pink and white tones, and it's just absolutely spectacular. I've never seen them do this before.
They look bright, and so we've left them there to grow and multiply.
And it's not that you've done nothing, is it? You've actually observed and left the space.
Well, if you can call doing nothing doing something, then yes, that's what we've done.
Keep doing more of that. Are these fritillary seed heads?
They are. The whole area before the hostas come up is completely covered with them. And I leave them to go to seed because that means we get more and more of them.
They're so stunning. But it's nice having that succession.
It
and then
is.
your hostas are fully up and very unblemished. Well, almost, not a hole inside.
Almost.
Frances is here with us now. Now, that was a beautiful garden, wasn't it? But I know that something you've been working on a lot recently is actually smaller gardens, gardens like more people might have that are a little bit trickier to make look pretty.
Well, they can be, or they can be a real gift, actually. It's just a completely different kind of design. I mean, I have had one friend who had a river going through her garden, a much smaller garden, but yeah, it's not usual, is it, to have that much space and that much amazing sort of natural landscape to work with. Most of us have a square, which is quite small, but you can really use that as something. It can be a room, you know, if you kind of blur the edges, it could be a jungle. You can make it feel like it goes on forever, but actually it's a tiny space. It can be a real sanctuary. You know, I feel very lucky to even have a small garden because I know lots of people don't even have that, you know.
Yeah, well, so what sort of size is your own garden then?
It's 9 by 10 metres, so smaller than average, but for me, you know, buying my first house, I was just so amazed even to have that, you know, that was the biggest garden I saw of all the houses I was looking at, and I was so glad to be able to get it.
So what is the plan, then, with your garden?
Well, it's emerging still. I mean, that's one of the things that I would definitely say if you have a new garden, don't rush it. You need to get to know exactly where the sun hits and when, because it changes through the year, you know, where the dry spots are, what your neighbours are like and what they'll kind of be happy with or not so happy with, because you want to keep them on side. So it's emerging, but at the moment, it's sort of a meadow-like space, you know. So not using wildflowers necessarily, but using, I love herbs, I love things I can eat. So kind of mingling edibles with pollinator-friendly flowers, herbs that you can use, but making it look very meadow-like and one big cohesive space. I think in a small garden, that's really crucial. Keep it simple, stick to one thing. Don't try and put too much in.
So does that mean then, so meadow-like means no lawn?
Well, I have 2 nephews who are very keen on me not getting rid of my tiny patch of lawn.
For football reasons, perhaps?
No, they say they like to stroll around the garden. Okay. It's about the size of this table, so, you know. Yeah. So I've got one tiny bit of lawn left in the middle, and I'm going to just let that grow. I'm not going to mow it at all, ever, and see if it gets that kind of tawny ochre colouring that will match in with the flowers I have around it and blend. If it doesn't blend, that will go as well, and then I'll just fill the whole thing with plants.
There are people across the country right now saying, great, permission not to mow the lawn, that sounds good. I've got a really small garden, I think mine's even smaller than yours, and we've just gone from it being a football pitch to trying to do something with it. And I feel really impatient, because I know you're saying don't rush it, but you want it to look nice immediately, don't you?
You do. I think, you know, tidy it, get to know it, do a bit of weeding. But has anything come up in the time
Yeah, a
you've been
few
there?
things have, but, you know, the thing is, if you buy a plant in a nursery or a garden centre, it looks quite big in the pot, and you put it in the ground and it kind of shrinks into the ground, and all of a sudden it looks a bit lonely, doesn't it?
You can have some of my plants because I've done the
Oh,
opposite.
now we're talking.
Bought so many plants for such a small space.
But they can be really expensive, can't they, buying plants? Any tips on kind of how you can reduce those costs but still get interesting and different stuff?
Yeah, I mean, buy them smaller, often, especially with things like trees. You know, getting them small, they settle in more quickly. They often grow as, you know, in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time, you won't see the difference between a big one and a small one because they will have caught up. So buying smaller plants is much cheaper, or you can buy bigger plants and then divide them and then put them in so you have 4. And that will look better, I think, with what you're talking about. Rather than having one plant, if you have 3 or 4 or 5 in a little cluster, that always looks nicer from the beginning, and they'll quickly fill out.
And I think any size of garden for lots of people is a bit intimidating. You know, you're saying you can leave the grass to grow, plant it as a meadow. I would be just too scared to do that and have anything other than like a square of grass with some flowers around the edge, which is really boring.
That is what I did in the first year. I wanted to get some plants in, so I just put them around the edge. But, you know, even I found it slightly intimidating, and I'm a gardener. You know, my first ever garden that I own, it's like, what do you do with this space? You could do anything. And so that's why the waiting and observing and how do you feel? What do you need from your garden, but also what do you want from your garden? Can you combine some of those things to make features that provide practicalities and also kind of whims? But it can be intimidating, and I think we all have to battle with that. Just kind of go for it, do something. And the lovely thing is you can always shift things around, especially in the autumn and winter. You know, move plants if they're not quite in the right place. I've moved my trees, got way too many trees for a small garden.
You've moved your trees?
I've moved my trees twice already. So it's always a check. I mean, you can't do...
Do you risk killing them?
After a few years, you do. But I just planted them, so they hadn't fully settled in yet. So I've kind of shifted them again in the winter or the autumn when they're dormant. Give them plenty of water, and then they will hopefully survive. But you know, after a few years, that's it. You can't move them again.
Isn't that interesting that gardening is basically the opposite of modern life? You need to be patient and just see what happens.
You do.
It's hard now.
You need to connect with yourself as well. You know, what is this is your space? You know, what will I get from this? Because it has to be enjoyable. And gardening can be stressful. I think there's a lot of mythology about how relaxing it is, and it can be, but it can also feel quite overwhelming. So, you know, recognising that and making the space something that you can manage.
I think it's that honesty and empathy that you have, that you've brought to Gardener's World, that has made people really enjoy the advice that you give out, because you kind of understand what most of us think and feel. Is that something you were really keen to bring to the show?
Not consciously. I think I just can't help but say what comes into my head. Yeah, no, it's tricky. I think I work as a gardener. Whenever I'm doing TV stuff, I'm always working in normal life as a gardener, and so I recognise those stresses. When you have a boss wanting you to have, you know, vegetables for a restaurant or, you know, something like that, there are pressures and there are stresses, so I always recognise that. For me, it's a hobby, but it's also my job, so I don't intend to bring empathy. It just comes out.
Well, you're a real-life gardener, presenter and now writer, because the book is out tomorrow, Francis's book. It's called A Year in a Small Garden. Thank you very much indeed for coming.
Thanks,
Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Good luck.
No mud on you. No,
I wore my best clothes.
good to see you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.